The heart monitor screamed flatline at 11:47 p.m. Emily Carter had been in that room 30 seconds ago. Now security was dragging her toward the exit, while Dr. Victor Lang stood over a dying man and did absolutely nothing useful. "That patient doesn't have 5 minutes," she told him. He'd laughed, called her just a nurse, had her removed like a problem to be managed. Then the convoy arrived. 6 military vehicles, no sirens, moving fast and deliberate through the Riverside Regional parking lot. The lead officer stepped out, looked at the building, and said 3 words into his radio. "Find Emily Carter." Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. Like this video and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The shift had started badly and gotten worse by degrees. Emily Carter arrived at Riverside Regional Medical Center at 6:48 p.m., 12 minutes before her scheduled start. Because she was always early. Not because anyone expected it of her. In 4 months working the emergency department, she'd learned that nobody here tracked her contributions closely enough to notice punctuality. But because arriving early gave her time to read the board, check which attending was on, and mentally prepare for whatever the night might require. Preparation wasn't a habit for Emily. It was something older and more instinctual than habit. It was just how she moved through the world. Brighton, Oregon. In late November, sat under the kind of cold that came off the Pacific and settled into the bones of the city without announcing itself. The hospital was a 7-story building on Hargrove Avenue, newer than it looked from the outside, recently renovated in the way that institutions renovate when they want to appear modern without actually restructuring anything important. The ER occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor, 42 beds, 1 trauma bay. On a bad night, those numbers were a joke. Tonight was already shaping up to be a bad night. She clocked in, changed, and was reading the handoff notes from the outgoing charge nurse, Delia Marsh, who always wrote in bullet points and never made eye contact when she was tired, when she heard his voice carrying from the trauma bay. "I didn't ask for your input, I asked for vitals." Dr. Victor Lang, chief of surgery, attending physician of record for the night shift, and a man who occupied space in a way that made you aware of his presence before you ever saw his face. He was 51, trim, silver at the temples, and he wore his authority like a garment he'd tailored specifically to cause discomfort in others. His reputation at Riverside Regional was the kind that got whispered about rather than discussed openly. Brilliant in the OR under ideal conditions, brittle under anything else. The nurses had a shorthand for his moods that they passed between themselves in glances and small gestures, a silent vocabulary born of self-preservation. Emily had her own read on him, formed quietly over 4 months of observation. She kept it to herself. She tucked the handoff notes into her pocket and moved toward the central station. The first 2 hours were unremarkable by ER standards, which meant they were relentless. A 14-year-old with a forearm fracture. An elderly woman presenting with chest tightness that turned out to be a panic attack and a medication interaction that nobody had caught for 8 months. A construction worker with a nail through his palm who was more embarrassed than in pain. Emily moved between patients with the specific economy of someone who had learned in a different context that wasted motion had consequences. She was restocking the supply cart near Bay 6 when the paramedics brought in Marcus Hale. She knew his name later. In the moment, he was a 44-year-old male, unconscious, BP cratering, the paramedic running alongside the gurney reading vitals in the flat cadence of someone delivering very bad news very quickly. Blunt thoracic trauma, vehicle versus pedestrian. GCS of 8 on scene, dropped to 6 en route, suspected tension, pneumo. We tried needle decompression at the scene and got, "I'll take it from here." Lang stepped in front of the paramedic before he could finish the sentence. It was a small, practiced move, the kind of thing you did when you wanted to establish command and didn't care about the information you were cutting off. Emily fell into position at the foot of the gurney, not because she'd been assigned to the trauma bay, she hadn't, technically, that was Priya Okafor's rotation, but because she could see what was happening to this man's chest from 15 feet away, and what she saw made something go very quiet inside her. His trachea was deviated. Not obviously, not the kind of thing you'd see at a glance without knowing what to look for, but she could see it. She'd seen it before. In worse places than this, under worse conditions, with considerably fewer resources. Lang was calling for an intubation tray. Not wrong exactly, but not right either. Not yet. Not before. Dr. Lang. She kept her voice level. His trachea shifted left. If it's a tension pneumo that's still building, intubation before decompression could... I can see his airway, nurse. He didn't look up. The paramedic said the needle decompression at the scene didn't relieve it. That could mean the paramedic missed. He picked up the laryngoscope. I need this bay clear of people who aren't directly involved in the procedure. Priya caught Emily's eye from across the gurney. A flicker of something. Agreement, maybe, or apology. Then she looked away. Emily didn't move. With respect, sir, if the decompression didn't work, we should be looking at finger thoracostomy before we secure the airway. The pressure differential? Lang set the laryngoscope down. Not gently. The room got very still in the specific way rooms got still when someone with authority decided to make a point. I don't know what they taught you before you got here, he said, and his voice had dropped to the register he used when he wanted to make sure everyone present heard without being able to call it shouting. But in my ER, nurses monitor and report. They don't diagnose. They don't recommend procedure sequencing, and they absolutely do not interrupt a senior physician mid-assessment to offer opinions they're not qualified to give. He looked at the charge nurse. Somebody call security. The patient doesn't have 5 minutes, Emily said. Security, he said again, still looking at the charge nurse. She heard herself say it one more time, not louder, not with any particular heat in it. He doesn't have 5 minutes, Dr. Lang. He turned back to the patient and picked up the laryngoscope again. The security guard who appeared at the bay entrance was a man named Roy, who Emily had spoken to exactly 3 times over 4 months, all 3 times pleasantly. Roy looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that his job was occasionally to be the instrument of something unfair and had made his peace with that. Ma'am, I need you to come with me. She looked at Marcus Hale on the gurney. His color was wrong. Not the pale of blood loss, but the specific duskiness of someone whose body was running out of available oxygen and had begun making decisions about which systems to prioritize. She recognized it. She knew what came next if nobody did what needed to be done. She went with Roy. The corridor outside the trauma bay was fluorescent and quiet, the sounds of the ER slightly muffled, a different quality of air. Roy walked beside her toward the staff exit and said genuinely, I'm sorry about this. It's not your call, she said. She wasn't angry at Roy. She was thinking about chest cavity pressure and what happened to cardiac output when the pressure crossed a certain threshold and how fast that threshold could arrive when you weren't looking for it. They were 40 feet from the trauma bay when the monitor alarm changed pitch. It's a sound that cuts through everything else in a hospital, that flat, sustained tone that means the rhythm is stopped. Emily had heard it in places where the sound was followed by chaos and loss, and the specific helplessness of having done everything and still not enough. She'd also heard it in places where people ran toward it and fixed it. She knew, in the 3 seconds between hearing it and making a decision, exactly what was happening in that bay and what had to happen next. She turned around. Ma'am, Roy started. She was already moving. She hit the doors of the trauma bay at a pace that was not quite running, not yet, and took in the scene in a single second of processing that felt from the inside like no time at all. Lang was standing back from the gurney. The intubation tray was on the floor. Priya had the crash cart open and was drawing up epinephrine with hands that were steady but moving too fast, the way hands moved when the person attached to them was suppressing panic. A second-year resident named, she had to think, Kaminsky, stood with the defibrillator paddles and looked like he had briefly forgotten how to exist. Paddles down, Emily said as she moved to the right side of the gurney. Not loud, just clear. Kaminsky looked at Lang. Lang hadn't spoken. Paddles down, she said again. Defib isn't going to fix this. His heart stopped because there's no room for it to beat. We need to decompress the chest. You were removed from this bay, Lang said. Something in his voice had changed, though. The certainty was thinner. Yes. She was already palpating the chest, confirming what she already knew was there. Sue me later. Priya had stopped drawing up the epinephrine. She was watching Emily. 14-gauge needle, Emily said. Now, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, and someone needs to be ready with a finger thoracostomy kit because if one isn't enough, we're going in. This is not protocol, Lang started. Your protocol isn't working. She looked at Priya directly. Get me the needle. There was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, where the room hung between two possibilities. Emily had been in rooms like this before. The moment always felt longer than it was. Someone always had to decide to move. Priya moved. She crossed to the supply station, pulled the 14-gauge needle from the tray, and handed it to Emily without a word. Emily had the needle in the correct anatomical position before Kaminsky had finished processing what was happening. She felt the release, the specific, unmistakable give of pressure finding an exit, and heard the air. The monitor changed. Not flatline, not normal, not yet, not even close to normal, but something, a rhythm trying to reassert itself. He needs a chest tube, Emily said, keeping her fingers exactly where they were. Right side, 5th intercostal, mid-axillary. Kaminsky? She looked at him and he straightened, something clicking on behind his eyes. You're going to do it. You know the landmarks. Yes. He moved. Yes, okay. Priya, push the epi. Half the dose you had drawn. His pressure's going to respond now that the tension's off, so don't spike it. Lang hadn't moved from where he was standing. Nobody was looking at him. The next 9 minutes were the kind of 9 minutes that hospitals built their legends around, and their trauma training around, and their liability policies around. Emily directed and Kaminsky executed, and Priya anticipated, and it wasn't smooth. Kaminsky's hands were shaking on the chest tube insertion, and Emily had to talk him through a step he missed, and the crash cart's secondary defibrillator made a sound it wasn't supposed to make and had to be swapped mid-procedure. But it held together. The rhythm held. Marcus Hale did not die. He was not by any stretch okay. He was going to need surgery, probably multiple surgeries, and the next 72 hours were going to tell the real story. But his heart was beating in a pattern that meant something instead of nothing, and his blood pressure had climbed to a number that a body could sustain for long enough to do more work, and the blue had started to recede from his lips. The room came down from its pitch slowly. The particular silence that follows an emergency when it goes the right direction settled in. Someone exhaled. Someone else set down an instrument. Emily stepped back from the gurney. She was aware, in the way she'd trained herself to be aware, of the room's full geometry. Priya, writing something on the chart with a hand that was now very still. Kaminsky, looking at his own hands like he was checking to make sure they still belonged to him. 2 nurses near the cart who hadn't been in the room for the crisis itself, but had drifted in near the end and stayed. A medical student near the door whose name Emily didn't know, standing motionless. Lang. He was still in the same position he'd been in since Emily returned to the bay. He had not touched the patient. He had not issued an instruction. He had watched. Emily pulled the gloves off her hands and dropped them in the biohazard bin. Lang found his voice. It was different now. Thinner, and with something underneath it that she recognized as the specific anger of a man who had been exposed in front of witnesses and was already looking for the frame he was going to put around it. What you just did, he said, was a violation of protocol, she finished for him. You mentioned that. You were removed from this room. You were escorted out by security. You returned without authorization and performed unauthorized procedures on a patient under my care. Under your care, she said. Yes. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The room said it for her. The patient on the gurney with a chest tube doing what a chest tube was supposed to do, and a heart beating when it hadn't been beating, and 9 minutes that nobody in this room was going to remember as Victor Lang's finest hour. I'll be reporting this to administration, he said. That sounds right, she said. You should probably tell them about the procedure sequencing decision, too. They'll want the full picture. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. What the footage showed. What the chart showed. What 9 people in this room had watched happen. Get out of my ER, he said. Quietly, now. The register had changed again. She picked up her badge from where it had landed on the floor sometime during the procedure and walked toward the bay doors. She was in the corridor, walking without particular hurry toward the staff break room, when she heard it, not from inside the hospital, but from outside, through the glass of the east corridor's exterior wall. The sound of vehicles. Multiple, moving in tight formation. No sirens, which somehow made it worse. Sirens meant emergency response. No sirens meant something more deliberate than that. She stopped walking. Through the glass, she could see the parking lot. 6 vehicles, military marked, desert tan, moving in from the Hargrove Avenue entrance in a line that was something between a convoy and a formation. Not fast, controlled. The kind of arrival that assumed the destination was going to wait for them. The lead vehicle stopped. The door opened. The man who stepped out was in his 40s wearing service dress, and he stood very still for a moment in the cold November air and looked at the hospital. Then he said something into the radio at his shoulder. Emily watched from the corridor. She couldn't hear what he said through the glass. She didn't need to. She had last spoken to Commanding Officer Darian Wells 2 years and 4 months ago on a different continent, under circumstances that the hospital on Hargrove Avenue in Brighton, Oregon, would have found very difficult to believe. He was looking at the building, and then, as if the building had answered him, he turned and looked directly at the east corridor windows. Directly at her. Emily didn't move. In the trauma bay behind her, Victor Lang was already composing the report he planned to submit to administration. He was, she understood, the kind of man who moved fast to control the record when he felt the record turning against him. Wells spoke into his radio again. A second man stepped out of the lead vehicle, uniformed, carrying a case of the kind that locked from the inside. The rest of the convoy doors opened. Emily stood in the corridor between the trauma bay, where she'd just pulled a man back from the edge, and the parking lot, where 6 military vehicles were deploying people with a purposefulness that had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with someone having made a phone call that she had not been aware of. Her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped moving. They did that sometimes, after. The small, fine tremor that her body ran through itself to discharge whatever it had been holding. It lasted about 30 seconds, and then it was gone. She'd learned not to try to stop it. You didn't stop a discharge. You let it happen, and then you moved. The tremor finished. She straightened. Down the hall, she heard someone say loudly enough to carry, "There are military personnel entering through the main entrance." And then, from much closer, Roy, the security guard, who had materialized at her elbow with an expression that had moved well past apologetic into something genuinely unsettled. "Ms. Carter, there are some people here asking for you specifically." Some people turned out to be 7 of them. Emily followed Roy back toward the main entrance at a pace that wasn't hurried because she'd learned a long time ago that how you moved toward something told the room everything about whether you were afraid of it. She wasn't afraid of Darian Wells. She wasn't sure what she was, exactly. The 9-minute procedure had burned through most of her available adrenaline, and what was left felt less like emotion and more like the flat, functional alertness that her nervous system defaulted to when it understood that whatever came next was going to require her complete attention. The main entrance lobby of Riverside Regional was a wide, low-ceilinged space with seating areas that always smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and the particular anxiety of people who were waiting for news they weren't sure they wanted. At this hour, it was half-populated. A family in the corner with a sleeping child, a man in his 60s pacing near the reception desk, a night shift administrator named Sandra, who ran the front desk with the expression of someone who had made peace with chaos as a permanent condition of employment. Sandra had not made peace with this. She was standing very straight behind her desk, watching 7 people in U.S. Army service dress cross the lobby floor with the kind of collective purpose that made the space feel smaller. Wells was in front. 2 captains flanked him, slightly behind. The other 4 held positions that weren't exactly security detail, not staged for threat response, just present, attentive, in the way of people who were there to witness something official. Wells saw her before she reached the lobby. She saw him see her. He was 46, built like someone who had never quite left the physical discipline of active service, with a face that had been weathered into something that read as calm until you were close enough to see the precision in his eyes. He'd aged since she last saw him. They both had. That was, she supposed, what 2 years and 4 months did. He stopped when she was 12 feet away. Not a dramatic pause, just the natural stop of a man who needed to look at something carefully before he spoke about it. Carter. Sir. The title came out automatically, the old groove still there, and she watched something flicker across his face at it. Not satisfaction, not sentiment, something more complicated than either. Are you injured? It was such a specific first question. She understood it immediately. No, sir. We had a report of a medical emergency in progress. There was some confusion about your status in the building. Confusion, she said. That's what I'm told. He glanced past her toward the corridor that led to the ER. The patient? Stabilized. He'll need surgery. The next few hours will matter. Wells nodded once, processing. Then he looked at the two captains flanking him, a woman named Doss, if Emily was reading the nameplate correctly, and a man she didn't recognize, and said, "Give me a few minutes." They moved off. The other four arranged themselves with the unconscious efficiency of people who had been told to be present without being intrusive, which was a harder thing to execute than it sounded. Wells looked back at Emily. "How long have you been here?" he said. "Brighton. 4 months. We didn't find you until 6 weeks ago." She absorbed that. "You were looking." "Not officially." He said it in a way that made clear there was a distinction between official looking and the other kind, and that the distinction mattered to him. "You didn't exactly advertise." "I wasn't trying to hide." She paused. "I was trying to be done." "I know." The lobby had gotten quieter in the way lobbies got quiet, when the people in them became aware that something was happening that they didn't have context for but instinctively understood was significant. The family in the corner had stopped their low conversation. Sandra had found something to study on her computer screen with excessive attention. "Why are you here, sir?" Emily asked. Not rudely, just directly. Wells seemed to consider how much of the answer to give her in this particular location. He looked around the lobby once, not nervously, the way a man cataloging the room for calculation purposes looked around, and then looked back at her. "That patient on your table," he said. "Marcus Hale." She waited. "He's not a random pedestrian, Emily." She noticed the shift to her first name. Wells used last names the way most people used punctuation, structurally, as a matter of form. The first name meant something was changing in the conversation. "Tell me," she said. He told her. It took about 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the lobby continued its quiet performance of normalcy around them, and Emily stood still and listened, and felt the night rearrange itself around a new set of facts. Marcus Hale was a former Army warrant officer and current federal contractor who'd been working with a joint task force on a critical infrastructure assessment. The nature of the assessment was above the clearance level appropriate for a hospital lobby, so Wells gave her the edges without the interior. What she needed to understand was this. Hale's presence in Brighton was not coincidental. His accident was under active review by 2 separate federal agencies as potentially not an accident, and his medical outcome over the next 72 hours had implications that went beyond the personal. She also needed to understand that when Hale had been brought into Riverside Regional, rather than to the military medical facility 40 minutes north, which would have been the logical choice if anyone had been thinking clearly about who he was, someone had made a call from the ambulance, and that call had reached Wells's team within 11 minutes. "Who made the call?" Emily said. "The paramedic." She recognized Hale's military ID in his wallet. She made a judgment call about transport distance versus available trauma resources. Wells paused. She didn't know the trauma department here was going to have a personnel problem. Personnel problem? She let that sit for a moment. "How much do you know about what happened in that bay?" "Enough." His jaw shifted slightly. "I have questions about the rest." "Your questions are going to have company," Emily said. "The attending has already said he's filing a report." "I know what the attending is filing." Something in his voice went flat and final. "And I know what the footage shows. We had eyes on this building from the moment Hale's transport was confirmed." She looked at him. "You had surveillance on the hospital. On Hale. He's a federal asset in a sensitive operational context. The surveillance came with the territory." He met her gaze steadily. "I didn't know you were here, Emily. If I had, I would have..." He stopped, which was unusual for Wells. He didn't usually stop mid-sentence. I would have handled the approach differently. She didn't ask what differently meant. She had a reasonable sense of it, and the night was already full enough. "What do you need from me now?" she asked. "Right now, I need you to go back to that patient and tell me exactly what you found, what you did, and what his status is with specificity. My team brought a medical officer, but she needs to be briefed on the case before she goes in." He glanced toward the corridor again. "And then I need you to not leave this building until we've had a longer conversation." "I've already been asked to leave this building twice tonight," she said. "You're not being asked," Wells said. "I'm informing you of the operational requirement." The faintest edge of something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. She recognized it. He'd always communicated humor the way he communicated everything else, efficiently, without waste. She turned toward the ER corridor. He fell into step beside her. They were halfway down the hall when Victor Lang appeared. He came out of the administrative corridor that branched off the main hallway, which meant he'd gone upstairs instead of staying in the ER, which meant he'd already been to administration, which meant the last 20 minutes had been less about patient care and more about paperwork. He was carrying a folder, actual physical paper, which struck Emily as the kind of detail that revealed something about a person. And he stopped when he saw them. He took in Wells. He took in the uniform, the rank insignia, the two captains who had materialized at the far end of the corridor with the quiet inevitability of people who went where Wells went. He took in Emily beside him. The folder stayed in his hands, but something shifted in how he was holding it. "Dr. Lang," Wells said. He didn't slow his stride. Lang fell back a step, which was involuntary, and then seemed to become aware that he'd done it. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Commanding Officer Darian Wells, U.S. Army Medical Command." Wells had stopped now, facing Lang with an expression of professional neutrality that Emily recognized as more dangerous than anger. "You're the attending on the patient brought in at approximately 11:43? "I am," Lang said. He'd found something like his footing again. The folder came up slightly, the way people raised objects when they wanted to remind themselves they were holding something. "And I need to tell you that the nurse accompanying you saved the patient's life," Wells said. "A beat, Nate." Wells interfered with an active trauma procedure and performed unauthorized. Performed a needle decompression and directed chest tube placement on a patient in cardiac arrest, secondary to tension pneumothorax after the attending physician had initiated intubation without first addressing the obstructive pathology. Wells's voice was entirely conversational. "That's what the footage shows, Doctor. I've seen it." Lang's mouth opened and then closed. "You've seen?" he started. "We had surveillance on the patient," Wells said. "For reasons I'm not going to explain to you in this hallway. What I can tell you is that we have complete footage of everything that happened in that trauma bay from 11:43 to approximately 12:18, and that footage has already been transmitted to my command." He paused. "Whatever you're filing tonight, I'd encourage you to be thorough, because the documentation from our end is going to be very thorough." He turned back toward the ER corridor and kept walking. Emily moved with him without looking back at Lang. She heard the folder hit the linoleum, not thrown, dropped, the sound of hands that had stopped working the way their owner expected, and then nothing else. The military medical officer Wells had brought was a major named Tran, 30-something, efficient in the way of someone who had worked in fast environments and stopped performing calm because she'd grown into it. Emily briefed her on Hale's case in the corridor outside the trauma bay, laying out the procedure sequence, the physiological reasoning, the current status, and the critical monitoring flags for the next 2 hours. Tran listened without interrupting, asked 2 specific questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, and then went in. The trauma bay had been reorganized since Emily left. Kaminsky was still there, writing notes, and he looked up when Emily appeared in the doorway, and then immediately looked at the people behind her and then back at Emily with an expression that was doing a lot of work at once. "He's holding," Kaminsky said. His voice was careful. "Pressure's stable, sinus rhythm." "Good." Emily stepped inside. "This is Major Tran. She's taking over medical oversight on this patient." Kaminsky nodded with the particular acquiescence of someone who understood that the authority structure of the room had reorganized itself and was not going to argue with the new configuration. Tran went to the bedside. Emily watched her run a fast but complete assessment: hands, eyes, monitor, chart, with the economy of someone who had done exactly this kind of rapid takeover before, in context that probably made this one look manageable. Priya was at the medication station in the corner, her back to the door, charting. She turned when she heard people enter, saw Emily, and went through a fast sequence of expressions before settling on something that was mostly relief. "He's been stable for 18 minutes, Priya said, directing it at Emily rather than at the military personnel, which was a choice that said something. "His SATs are at 93 and trending up." "Okay." Emily looked at the monitors herself. Hale's face was slack under the oxygen mask, the specific blankness of sedation, lines running from 3 different sites. He was maybe 44 in the way that hard-lived people were 44, the years sitting differently in the body than they did for people who had spent them more gently. She looked at him for a moment. She'd pulled him back from somewhere most people didn't come back from, at least not tonight, at least not in this bay, and the specific weight of that hadn't fully settled yet. It would later. It always did later, in the particular quiet of a night that had finally stopped demanding things. Wells appeared behind her shoulder. She was aware of him without turning. "What's your read?" he said, low enough that it was meant only for her. "He needs the OR within 6 hours. Probably sooner. The chest tube is buying time." She kept her voice the same register as his. "He lost a lot of pressure. There's going to be some cascade effects we won't fully see until tomorrow." "Can he be moved?" "Not yet." She looked at Wells now. "You're thinking about the facility north of here. It's better equipped for his specific situation. He's not stable enough for transport. Moving him in the next 4 hours could undo everything." She held Wells's gaze. "I know what he is to you and whatever you're working on, but right now he's a patient with a traumatic chest injury, and his body doesn't care about the operational context." Wells looked at Hale. He was quiet for a moment that felt like a decision being made. "Agreed," he said. "He stays. Tran works the case." He looked at Emily. "And so do you." "I'm not sure the hospital would agree with that." "The hospital," Wells said, "is about to have a conversation with my legal liaison that's going to clarify several things, including the matter of what authority looks like in a situation involving a federal asset." She thought about laying upstairs with his folder and whatever version of the night he was currently constructing on paper. "That conversation," she said, "might get complicated. I handle complicated for a living." He left the bay. Emily stayed. She spent the next 40 minutes beside Hale's gurney, monitoring, adjusting, watching the numbers with the specific patience of someone who understood that the difference between a stable patient and a crashing one was sometimes a matter of catching the small shifts before they became large ones. Tran worked alongside her, and they didn't talk much, because they didn't need to. They were operating from the same clinical vocabulary, the same instinct about what the monitors were saying and what they weren't, and that kind of shared understanding made conversation mostly redundant. Kaminsky stopped by twice. He stood in the doorway rather than entering, which she appreciated. The second time he said, "For what it's worth," and then stopped, and she waited, and he said, "I've never seen anyone move that fast and that—" "I don't know. Certain." He paused. "Not in this building." "You did fine," she told him. "The chest tube was clean." "My hands were shaking." "Your hands were shaking and you put it in the right place," she said. "That's the part that matters." He nodded and left. She went back to watching the monitors. It was at the 43-minute mark, when Hale's pressure had climbed to a number that permitted cautious optimism and Tran had gone out to update Wells, that Emily heard the raised voice from the corridor. Not Lang. She recognized Lang's register, and this wasn't it. This was higher, sharper, someone who had misplaced their professional composure and hadn't gone to retrieve it yet. She moved to the bay doorway. The corridor held 3 people. A hospital administrator she recognized as Deputy Director Clifton Marsh, no relation to Delia, just the particular coincidence of a common name. A man in his 40s with the Army Legal Liaison rank of JAG Major, and a woman Emily hadn't seen before who was holding a tablet and standing in the posture of someone who had been told to document everything and was doing so. Marsh was the one who had been loud. He'd gotten himself under control by the time Emily could see him, but the flush was still in his neck. "That's not how this facility operates," he was saying, clipped and precise now, the voice of someone carefully choosing words. "We have protocols, we have chains of authority. What happened tonight in that trauma bay cannot simply be resolved by your internal protocols," the JAG major said, and he was very calm. "I understand that's frustrating. I'm telling you that the circumstances of the patient in Bay 1 have federal dimensions that supersede several of your institutional concerns. You cannot come into this hospital and override medical authority. I'm not overriding medical authority, I'm explaining jurisdiction." The major glanced at his tablet. "Your hospital has a memorandum of understanding with the Regional Military Medical Command dating from 2019. Section 4, paragraph 3 covers the treatment of personnel under active federal medical oversight. Mr. Hale qualifies. This is not an argument, it's a notification." Marsh's jaw was working in the way of a man who had things to say and was calculating the cost of saying them. Emily stepped back from the doorway before Marsh looked her direction. She didn't want to be part of that corridor conversation tonight. There would be other conversations, and she'd need something left for those. She went back to the monitors. Hale's SATs had hit 95. Small victories, she thought. The night ran on them. It was closer to 2 a.m. when Wells returned to the bay. He came in quietly, closed the distance to where Emily was standing, and looked at Hale for a moment before he spoke. "Lang submitted his report," he said. "How long ago?" "About an hour. It went to administration and copied the state medical board." He paused. "Our legal team has already responded to both. The footage and medical record are in their hands." Emily didn't say anything. "He's calling it unauthorized procedure, insubordination, failure to comply with a direct order from a supervising physician." Wells's tone was descriptive, not editorial. "He's framing it as a patient safety incident." "He would," she said. "There are 9 witnesses in that room who would characterize it differently." "Witnesses aren't a report. Witnesses are something you have to ask for." She looked at the monitors rather than at Wells. "He moved fast. He knows how this works." "So do I." Wells let a moment pass. "And so, I think, does Priya Okafor, who submitted her own incident documentation 40 minutes ago through the hospital's nursing union protocol. She listed herself as a witness to the events in the Bay and characterized the attending physician's decision-making as," he glanced briefly at something on his phone, "inconsistent with the patient's presentation and potentially contraindicated by visible clinical indicators." Emily looked at him. "She did that on her own," she said. It wasn't a question, but she wanted it confirmed. "I'm told she had help drafting the language from a colleague in the nursing department, but the submission was hers." He put the phone away. "You apparently made an impression on people in there." She thought about Priya pulling the 14-gauge needle from the tray and crossing the room without hesitation. The 3 seconds of decision. Someone always had to move first. "She made her own impression," Emily said. Wells nodded. He moved slightly to the left, the way he always had when he was about to say something that required a different angle. A physical tick so small she'd forgotten she knew it. "There's something else." She waited. "The state medical board has a system. When a complaint comes in against a physician, they run a cross-reference on prior complaints, prior investigations, prior disciplinary actions." He folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Lang has 3 prior complaints in his file, 2 from nursing staff, 1 from a resident. None of them went anywhere at the time." "They never do," Emily said. "Until there's footage," Wells said, "and a federal case number attached to the patient file, and a JAG officer standing in the administrator's office explaining the legal implications of how the investigation is handled." He paused. "Things that didn't go anywhere sometimes start moving when the conditions change." She was quiet for a moment. Through the bay's internal window, she could see the corridor where, 2 hours ago, Roy had walked her toward the exit while a man was dying for want of 2 inches of metal and a decision. The corridor looked the same. The corridor had no idea what had happened to it tonight. "Why are you really here, Darian?" she said. She used his first name deliberately, the way he'd used hers, marking the shift in register. "Not for Hale. Not just for Hale." He looked at her directly. He had always been willing to be looked at directly, which was rarer than it should have been. There's a position, he said. Not a reinstatement, something different. The Army Medical Command is building a new trauma training integration program, civilian and military protocols, cross-training, joint response capability. The Hale situation tonight is actually a good example of the gap it's designed to close. He paused. They need someone to run it who understands both sides, who's operated in both environments, who doesn't have to be taught what the gap looks like because they've stood in it. She held his gaze. I've been out for 2 years. I know. I left because I needed to leave. I know that too. He didn't move. I'm not here to tell you that you need to go back to something. I'm here because the program exists and you're the best person for it, and you deserve to know it's there. He glanced at Hale briefly. And because apparently you haven't actually left anything. You've just been doing it somewhere smaller. The monitors hummed. Hale's chest rose and fell with the steady, borrowed patience of a man who had more work to do if he could manage to stay alive long enough to do it. Emily didn't answer. She wasn't ready to answer. The night was still too recent, the procedure too close, the corridor conversation about the position too new to process against everything else that had happened since 6:48 p.m. But she was still thinking about it when the bay doors opened and Kaminsky came in fast. Not running, but the walk of someone who had gotten information that required speed and said, "Carter, there's a problem." She was already turning. "Hale?" No, it's Lang." She waited. Kaminsky looked between her and Wells with the expression of someone who had walked into a room and found it more complicated than expected. "He's on the floor. Administration. He was on the phone with someone. The board, I think. And apparently—" He stopped, finding the words. "He collapsed. About 4 minutes ago." Wells went very still. Emily was already moving toward the door, the calculation already running. The irony of it, the terrible pragmatic irony, that the man who had tried to have her removed might now be the patient she was going to have to go find, on the floor of the administration wing. And the question of what she would do when she got there was not actually a question at all, which was the thing about training that nobody who hadn't done it quite understood. You didn't decide in the moment. The moment had already been decided. She hit the corridor at a pace that was this time running. The administration wing was on the second floor, which meant the stairwell, which meant Emily took it at a pace that had nothing polite about it, her shoes hitting the metal treads in a rhythm that echoed in the narrow space. Behind her, she could hear Wells moving. He'd followed without being asked, which was exactly what she would have expected. The second-floor corridor was different from the ER in the way that administrative spaces were always different from clinical ones. Quieter, carpeted, the lighting warmer and more deliberately designed to suggest that important decisions happened here rather than desperate ones. Right now it had 4 people standing in a loose, uncertain cluster near the open door of what she recognized as the deputy director's conference room, and 1 person on the floor. Lung was on his side, which was at least the correct unconscious position, someone having had the presence of mind to put him there rather than leaving him supine. He was breathing. She could see the rise and fall from 8 feet away, shallow but present. The woman crouching beside him was Sandra from the front desk, who had apparently followed someone up and was now pressing 2 fingers to his wrist with the expression of a person doing something they'd seen done without being fully confident they were doing it right. "Move," Emily said, not unkindly. Sandra moved. Emily went to her knees on the carpet beside Lang and ran the fast triage her hands defaulted to before her mind had to consciously direct them. Pulse, rate, regularity, then visual scan, color, breathing quality, position of the head and neck. His pulse was present and faster than it should have been, irregular in a specific way that told her something before she had the equipment to tell her more. His color was off. Not the dusky blue of oxygen failure, but a grayish pale that went with cardiac stress. His breathing was labored in the way of someone whose chest was working harder than the output warranted. "How long was he on the phone?" she asked the room. A man near the door, mid-50s, administrator type, name she didn't know, said, "Maybe 30, 40 minutes. Was he standing or sitting?" "Standing. He paces when he paces." "Did he say anything before he went down?" "He grabbed the table, said something about his arm." The man's voice had the particular thinness of someone still processing shock. "His left arm." Emily looked at Lang's left hand. She pressed the nail bed. Released. Counted. "Someone call a code and get a crash cart to this floor," she said. "Now." Wells was already on his radio. She repositioned herself, tilted Lang's head back slightly to open the airway, felt the quality of his breathing change in response. Better, marginally. His eyelids were moving, the flutter of someone not fully unconscious but not accessible either, somewhere in the territory between. "Dr. Lang." She put her hand on his shoulder with enough pressure to register. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened halfway. They were unfocused in the way of a man who had lost the thread of where he was and was trying to find it. "Left arm," she said. "Is the pain still there?" His mouth moved. She leaned closer. "Both," he said, or something close to it. "Both arms?" The faintest movement she decided to interpret as yes. She checked his necks. No obvious JVD, which ruled out one thing, but the irregular pulse and the bilateral arm involvement and the exertional context of 40 minutes of what had presumably been a very high-stress phone call were painting a picture she didn't like. She didn't like it more because the picture was sitting somewhere between cardiac event and stress response, and she didn't have the equipment to tell her which side of that line she was on. The crash cart arrived in 3 minutes, which was faster than she'd expected for a floor that didn't usually see codes. Behind it came a nurse she didn't recognize from this shift, and behind him Kaminsky, who had clearly run the stairwell and was breathing accordingly. "What have we got?" Kaminsky said. "Possible MI, possible severe vasospasm, pulse irregular at about 110, bilateral arm involvement, preceded by prolonged exertional stress, no loss of airway." She was attaching leads as she talked. The sticky sensors going on in the sequence she could do in her sleep, has done in significantly worse conditions than carpeted administrative hallways. "I need a 12 lead, and I need it fast." Kaminsky was already on the other side, helping attach the limb leads. He'd stopped looking uncertain. Something in him had clicked into the same mode she recognized from the trauma bay. Not calm exactly, but focused. It was useful. The ECG printed in under 2 minutes. Emily looked at the readout and felt the specific internal shift that happened when a picture clarified into a definite thing. "Get OR prep going," she said. "He's having a STEMI." The room absorbed that. An ST elevation myocardial infarction was not ambiguous. It was not stress response, and it was not a panic attack, and it was not something that resolved with rest and water. A portion of the muscle of Victor Lang's heart was dying right now for want of blood, and the rate at which it died was a direct function of how fast someone got a catheter into the right artery. "Aspirin, 325 milligrams. Chew it," she said, looking at the nurse beside the cart. "And call interventional cardiology. He needs a cath lab in the next 90 minutes if there's going to be tissue left to work with." The nurse moved. Kaminsky had the aspirin from the cart before she finished the sentence. Lang was more conscious now, enough to register what was happening in the way of a man who understood he was in trouble, but not yet the specific shape of it. "You're having a heart attack," Emily told him, "because people deserve to be told." She kept her voice flat and factual, not cold, just useful. "We're treating it. I need you to stay as still as possible and not exert yourself." Lang looked at her. His focus had sharpened enough for recognition. She could see the moment he understood who was crouching beside him on the floor of the administration wing. She watched him process it. She watched the layers of it move across his face, the helplessness, the specific indignity, something that might have been the beginning of something more complicated if his body hadn't been doing what it was currently doing. He looked away. "Do what she says," Wells said from behind Emily. It was quiet, but it arrived in the room with the weight of something that had already been decided. They held Lang on the floor until transport came. Moving a STEMI patient without a gurney and proper transfer protocol was how you turned a survivable event into an unsurvivable one. Emily held the lead placement and monitored his rhythm on the portable unit, and talked Kaminsky through the medication sequence. And when the cardiology team arrived with the gurney and the interventional fellow leading them introduced himself and started to take command of the scene, she stepped back and let him. That was the other thing about training. You knew when to hand off. She stood up. Her knees had the particular ache of hard floor and prolonged kneeling. She pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead. Not a gesture she'd planned, just something her body did when she reached the far edge of a long expenditure, and then dropped her hand and looked at the situation in front of her with the detached practicality of someone taking inventory. Lang was on the gurney. The cardiology team was moving. His rhythm on the portable showed the pattern of a blocked artery that was still blocked, which meant the 90-minute window was now closer to 85, and that was a problem for the interventional team and not for her. She had now saved 2 people's lives tonight who had every reason to hope she'd fail. Wells appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The irony," she said, "is not lost on me. I wasn't going to mention it." "Good call." They watched the cardiology team disappear around the corridor bend with Lang's gurney, the interventional fellow already on the phone with the cath lab, coordinating the prep that would determine whether Victor Lang had a functional heart at the end of this night or a permanently compromised one. The hallway settled back into its administrative quiet, the cluster of shocked onlookers dispersing with the specific reluctant energy of people who had witnessed something significant and were uncertain what to do with it. Sandra from the front desk was sitting in a chair against the wall. She was pressing both hands flat against her thighs and looking at the floor with the dazed expression of someone who had held a stranger's wrist in the dark and was still somewhere back in that moment. Emily crossed to her. She crouched down so their eye levels matched, which she'd learned a long time ago was the correct geometry for talking to someone whose nervous system had just taken a shock. "You did the right thing," Emily said. "Putting him on his side. That was the right call." Sandra looked up. Her eyes were wet at the edges, but she wasn't crying, more like the proximity of it. I just didn't know what else to do." That was enough. Emily meant it specifically. "Sometimes it is." She straightened and walked back to Wells. "Hale," she said. "Trans with him. His vitals held while you were up here. He still needs the OR. I've already spoken with the surgical team. They're prepping. There's a question of who leads." "Who's available?" Wells looked at her steadily. "Dr. Kaminsky can assist. The senior surgical attending is Dr. Reyes. She came in when the code went up." He paused deliberately. "She's been briefed on the case. She wants to talk to you before they open him." Emily looked at her hands. They were clean. She'd gloved for Lang, and she'd discarded them, and there was nothing visible to mark what the last 3 hours had moved through them. Hands were like that. They held no record of their own work. "Take me to Reyes," she said. Dr. Mara Reyes was 53, small, with the specific physical composure of a surgeon who had built her steadiness over decades rather than borrowed it from circumstance. She was standing outside the surgical suite in a gown that was already half-tied, which meant she'd been moving toward this before Emily arrived, which was the kind of detail Emily appreciated. Reyes looked her over once, fast, professional, the assessment of someone calibrating the person across from them without making a performance of it. "You stabilized him," Reyes said. It wasn't a question. "Bought time," Emily said. "The right side is compromised. When you go in, the pleural space is going to need evaluation before you touch the structural damage. The tension pneumo-resolved, but there was enough pressure duration that I'd want eyes on the adjacent tissue before you assume the decompression handled everything." Reyes nodded. "What else?" "His pressure was in the 80s when I decompressed. It came up clean, but he was hypoperfused for somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes before intervention. You may see some downstream effects in the next window that aren't directly about the chest injury. Organ perfusion, renal function specifically. I'd watch it." Reyes was quiet for a moment, looking at something that wasn't in the hallway. Processing. Emily recognized the expression, the internal construction of a surgical approach from the information being handed to it. "You have a military background," Reyes said. "Yes." "Battlefield thoracic." "Among other things." Reyes looked at her. "You want to scrub in." It wasn't a question either. It was the recognition of one technically specific person by another, the kind of professional reading that happened between people who had been trained hard enough that they could see the shape of training in someone else. Emily hadn't expected the offer, or the fact that it felt like an offer even though it had been stated as an observation. "That's your call," Emily said. "Yes," Reyes said. "It is." She turned back toward the surgical suite. "Scrub in. Your second set of hands, not primary. I know this OR and you don't. But if you see something from your end of the table that I need to know, you say it. Understood. And don't. Reyes paused at the suite door, turning back one more time with the specific look of a woman setting a single ground rule. Don't be quiet to be polite. I don't need polite. I need the patient alive. We agree on that, Emily said. She scrubbed in. The next 2 hours and 11 minutes existed in the specific suspended time of surgical work. The world reduced to the table, the field, the instruments, the constant low conversation of vital signs from the anesthesiologist at the head, and the precise, unhurried work of Reyes's hands moving through the interior of a body that had been very badly damaged and was being persuaded, piece by piece, to hold itself together. Emily stood across the table and did what she'd been told to do, watched, assisted when asked, and spoke when she saw something. She spoke 4 times. Each time Reyes paused, evaluated, made a decision. Twice she followed Emily's read. Once she didn't, and explained why in a sentence, and the explanation was correct. The 4th time, Emily pointed to an area of tissue that looked wrong in a specific way she recognized from a field context she had no good way to explain in a surgical suite without taking too long. And Reyes looked at it for 2 full seconds and said, "Yeah," and adjusted her approach. Hale survived the surgery. That was the fact of it. He was going to have a long road with significant rehabilitation ahead of him, and the next 48 hours were still going to tell some of the story, but the structural damage was repaired and the chest was closed, and his heart was doing what hearts were supposed to do. Reyes degloved in the scrub area afterward and said, without preamble, "Where did you train?" "Army Medical Command, then operational rotations." "We're operational." Emily named the theaters. She kept it brief because brief was accurate. The specific places and operations were classified in ways that a hospital scrub room was not the right environment to unclassify, but the general geography of where she'd worked could be said. Reyes was quiet for a moment, her hands under the running water. "I trained at Madigan," she said. "Military. 15 years before I came here." She looked at Emily sideways. "Which is how I know what I was looking at across that table." Emily didn't say anything. "What you did in the trauma bay tonight," Reyes said. "I've read the chart." "It wasn't—" "Don't minimize it," Reyes said, not unkindly. "I'm not complimenting you. I'm observing the clinical record." She turned off the water. Lang was going to intubate a tension pneumo without addressing the obstructive pathology. That patient would have died in 4 minutes. She dried her hands. "I've seen that exact sequence happen before. Usually nobody stops it." Emily looked at the drain in the scrub sink. The water going down was very clear. "I stopped it," she said. "That's all." "That's not all," Reyes said. "But you can say that if you want to." She left. Emily stood in the scrub room a moment longer, alone with the hum of the ventilation and the specific exhaustion of a night that had run through every register it had. She was still standing there when the door opened and Wells came in. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting outside a surgical suite for 2 hours and had spent that time thinking. "Hale's out," she said. "I know. Tran just briefed me." He folded his arms, the posture of someone containing something rather than displaying it. "How are you?" "Tired." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "That is what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "Administration has been notified about Lang's cardiac event. The state medical board contact who was expecting his follow-up call from tonight is now being briefed by our legal team instead." He paused. "The investigation into his conduct isn't going to wait for his recovery." "He nearly died," she said. "Yes, and so did Hale, and neither of those facts cancels the other." He met her eyes steadily. "He's going to be treated. He's going to recover. And the professional record of what happened in that ER tonight is going to be reviewed fully and on its merits." He paused. "That's how it should work." She didn't disagree. She was too tired to have an argument with something she agreed with. "The position," she said. Wells waited. "Tell me more about it tomorrow," she said, "when I've slept." Something in his posture shifted, not visible to anyone who didn't know him well enough, but she did. "All right." She moved toward the door. He stepped aside. She was in the corridor, the surgical suite behind her, the long institutional hallway ahead, when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from an internal hospital number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "We need to talk." Below the message, a name she didn't recognize either. Hartwell, K. Hospital Board of Directors. She stood in the corridor and looked at it. In the trauma bay, Marcus Hale was breathing. In the cath lab, Victor Lang's blocked artery was being opened by a team who had no idea about the events that had preceded his collapse. In the board member's office, or wherever Hartwell was messaging from at 3 in the morning, something was being prepared that she didn't have the shape of yet. She typed back, "When?" The reply came in 11 seconds. "Now." The board member's office was on the 5th floor, which meant Emily was in the elevator at 3:14 in the morning, still wearing scrub pants and a hospital-issue pullover that had been clean at the start of the shift and was not anymore. She'd washed her hands and face in the scrub room sink. That was the extent of her preparation for whatever this was. The elevator was slow. She used the time to think through the variables. Hartwell, K. She didn't know the name, which meant either a newer board member or one who operated at a remove from the clinical floors, the kind of person who governed without being visible, which was its own kind of power. The message had said now, at 3 in the morning, which meant one of 2 things. Either Hartwell was the kind of person who worked at 3 in the morning because the situation required it, or Hartwell was the kind of person who called people to meetings at 3 in the morning because the hour itself was a demonstration of authority. Emily had worked with both types. They required different handling. The 5th floor was quieter than the administrative wing had been. The corridor lights were on their overnight setting, full brightness in the elevator lobby, dim to 2/3 in the hallways, the particular fluorescent twilight of institutional buildings between midnight and dawn. A security guard she didn't recognize was stationed near the elevator bank and gave her a look that was professional without being unwelcoming. "Carter?" he said. "Yes." He pointed her down the hall without further conversation. The office at the end of the corridor had its door open and light coming from inside. Warm light, not overhead fluorescent, which meant a desk lamp or standing lamp, which meant whoever was in there had made a choice about the atmosphere they wanted to create. Emily filed that without deciding what to do with it yet. She knocked on the open door and went in. Kathleen Hartwell was 61, silver-haired, wearing a blazer over what appeared to be a sweater she'd put on in a hurry, which suggested she'd come in specifically for tonight rather than working late from earlier in the day. She was seated behind a desk that was organized in the way of someone who processed high volumes of information and needed to be able to find things without searching. On the desk in front of her, a laptop, a legal pad with writing on it, a cold cup of coffee, and a printed document that Emily could see had been annotated in red ink at multiple points. Beside Hartwell, in a chair angled toward the desk, sat a man Emily hadn't seen before. Late 40s, civilian clothes, with a government issue bearing that the civilian clothes didn't quite cover. He had a closed laptop on his knee and a stillness about him that went beyond patience. Hartwell stood when Emily entered. Not a formal gesture, more the automatic response of someone who had been waiting a long time and was relieved the waiting had ended. "Miss Carter," she said, "thank you for coming." "I didn't get the impression I was declining," Emily said. Hartwell absorbed that without visible reaction. She gestured toward the chair on the opposite side of the desk from the government man. "Please sit." Emily sat. "This is Garrett Odom," Hartwell said, indicating the man. "He's with the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. He's been in Brighton for 3 days on a matter that became significantly more relevant to this hospital approximately 4 hours ago." Odom nodded once in Emily's direction. It was the nod of a man who had given his name and title and considered that sufficient introduction for the moment. "What matter?" Emily said. Hartwell opened the annotated document on her desk and turned it so Emily could see the first page. It was a complaint form, multi-page, official formatting, the kind of form that had been revised by committee and was organized for legal defensibility rather than readability. At the top, a case number. Below it, the name of the institution, Riverside Regional Medical Center. Below that, the subject of the complaint, Dr. Victor Lang. "This isn't the complaint from tonight," Hartwell said. "This is a federal investigation that has been active for 7 weeks. Emily looked at the document and then at Hartwell. 7 weeks. The OIG opened it based on a referral from a former resident who left this hospital 14 months ago. Hartwell sat back down. The referral alleged a pattern of clinical misconduct, intimidation of medical staff, falsification of procedural records, and patient outcome misrepresentation. She paused. The investigation has been quiet because these things move quietly when they're moving correctly. What happened tonight accelerated the timeline significantly. Odom spoke for the first time. His voice was dry and precise. We have documentation spanning 31 months, patient records, internal communications, witness statements from 8 former and current staff members. He opened his laptop. What the security footage from the trauma bay tonight provides is something those 31 months of documentation couldn't give us directly. Real-time clinical decision-making caught on camera with a federal patient in the room and a military medical team as witnesses. He looked at Emily. You understand what that means? The footage is evidence in a federal investigation, she said. The footage is evidence that the pattern documented over 31 months continued tonight in a form that is legally unambiguous. He turned the laptop slightly toward her. I don't need you to identify yourself in that footage or testify to what you observed. We have 9 witnesses who were already present. What I'm here to tell you tonight is that your actions, specifically the written incident report submitted by Nurse Okafor corroborating your clinical assessment of the patient, constitute additional documentary evidence that will be incorporated into the federal record. Emily looked at the laptop screen. The footage from the trauma bay was paused on it, time-stamped, the image clear enough to read the monitor numbers in the background. She hadn't known she was walking into a room that already had a case file in it. She'd walked into the trauma bay thinking she was one nurse in one hospital on one bad night. Apparently she'd been something else as well, a final data point in a 7-week accumulation of evidence that had been building toward exactly this. What happens now? She said. Hartwell answered. Dr. Lang is currently in the cath lab. His cardiac event is being treated. When he's recovered enough to be notified, he will be served with a formal suspension order from this board. She held Emily's gaze. That's separate from the federal investigation. The hospital's action is based on tonight's footage and the 3 prior complaints in his file, which the board reviewed approximately 90 minutes ago in an emergency session. She paused. I called you here because you deserve to know the shape of what's happening before you read it in an internal memo, and because there are questions the board has that only you can answer. She picked up the legal pad and looked at her own handwriting. The nursing staff, specifically Nurse Okafor and 2 other nurses who have given informal statements tonight, indicated that what you did in that trauma bay, the clinical assessment, the procedure sequencing, the ability to direct a complex emergency without equipment or preparation, was not consistent with the background of a standard ER nurse. She looked up. We have your employment file. It's not unusual. It doesn't explain what they described. Emily was quiet for a moment. What did they describe? She said. Someone who knew things she shouldn't have been able to know. Someone who moved like she'd done it before. Not in a hospital. Hartwell's voice was careful, not accusatory. One of the nurses said it looked like she'd done it somewhere where being wrong meant people died. She had. That was accurate. She'd done it in places where being wrong meant exactly that. And she'd been wrong twice, and those 2 times lived in her in a specific way that the right calls didn't, because the right calls compounded into competence, and the wrong calls compounded into something you carried differently. She looked at Hartwell. At Odom. At the document with its red annotations and its 7 weeks of carefully assembled evidence. What are you asking me? She said. I'm asking who you are, Hartwell said. Off the record, and before anything else gets formalized, I'm asking who I have working in my ER. Before Emily could answer, the door opened. Wells came in. He didn't knock because he'd apparently decided the hour and the context put them past the knocking stage, and he looked at Hartwell and Odom with the specific expression of a man who had already assessed the room from the doorway and understood its composition. Ms. Hartwell, he said. Then to Odom. Garrett. Odom looked at Wells with something that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence. Darian. You know each other, Emily said. We've worked adjacent to each other before, Wells said, which was the military way of describing interagency cooperation that had involved enough complexity to make direct description inefficient. He took a position slightly behind Emily's chair, not over her, not beside her, just present in a way that said clearly that whatever was being decided in this room, he was a party to it. "She was going to tell you," Wells said to Hartwell, "but since I'm here, I'll make it faster." He looked at Hartwell steadily. Emily Carter is a former United States Army combat nurse, rank of Chief Warrant Officer 3 at the time of her separation. She served 3 operational deployments over 9 years. Her last deployment included a classified medical support operation, during which she was responsible for forward trauma management for a 12-person special operations element in an austere environment with no surgical backup. He paused. During that operation, she stabilized 9 critical trauma casualties over a 72-hour period using field-expedient techniques. 7 of them survived, who by standard field triage criteria should not have. The room was quiet. Several of the trauma response protocols currently in use by the Army Medical Command's forward surgical teams were derived from after-action documentation of her methods during that operation. Wells continued. She left the service 2 years ago with full honors. He looked at Emily. She left because she wanted to. Hartwell was looking at Emily with an expression that was moving through several registers. Odom had closed his laptop. "Why did you come here?" Hartwell said. "To Brighton. To this hospital." Emily considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "I wanted to do the work without the weight of everything else," she said. "The rank, the classification, the operational context. I wanted to be a nurse." She looked at her hands briefly. "I didn't stop being what I am because I stopped being in the Army, but I thought I could exist more quietly." "That's not quite what happened tonight," Hartwell said. The edge of something that might have been rye moved through her voice. "No," Emily said. "It's not." Odom stood. He was the kind of man who stood when he'd reached a decision, as if the physical act of it confirmed the internal one. "What I need from you tonight is simple. I need a written account of your clinical observations and actions from the time you entered the trauma bay until the time you were removed, and again from the time you returned until the patient was stabilized." He looked at Hartwell. "The board's action against Dr. Lang stands on its own. The federal investigation stands on its own. Ms. Carter's account is supplementary, but I want it in the record before morning." Emily nodded. "I can do that." "Tonight," Odom said. "I just came out of 2 hours of surgery," she said. "I know." He said it without apology because he understood, as she did, that the window for these things mattered. Memory degraded, details shifted. What she could write at 4 in the morning was closer to the truth of the night than what she could write at noon the next day after sleep had smoothed the sharp edges. "There's a room next door with a desk and a computer. Take whatever time you need, but I need it before I leave this building." She stood. "Fine." Wells followed her to the door. In the hallway, he stopped her with a hand on her arm. Not gripping, just contact. The specific weight of someone who needed a second of your attention. "You didn't have to be here tonight," he said quietly. "You were off the clock when you came in early. You were formally removed from the building, and you came back anyway." He paused. "I need you to understand that what you did is documented in a federal case record now. That means it's protected. Whatever Lang files, whatever the hospital's internal process generates, the federal record exists alongside it, and it says something different than whatever he was writing in that folder." She looked at him. "Is that why you came in tonight? The federal record?" "I came in tonight because of Hale." He met her eyes. "I stayed because of you." She didn't have a response for that at 4 in the morning. She went into the room next door and sat at the desk and started writing. It took 47 minutes. She wrote it the way she'd been trained to write after-action documentation. Chronologically, clinically, without adjectives where nouns would do the work. She wrote what she saw when she entered the bay, what she assessed, what she recommended, what was done instead, what resulted. She wrote what she saw when she returned, the monitor reading, the patient's color, the position of the attending, the state of the tray. She wrote the procedure sequence and the physiological reasoning behind each step and the outcome. She did not write anything about how it felt to do it. After-action documentation was not for that. She printed it, signed it, and gave it to Odom, who was waiting in the hall. He read the first page standing up. Then he looked at her with something that was close to respect, but was too careful to be called that outright. The expression of a man who had been in this work long enough to value precision above almost everything. "This is thorough," he said. "That's how I write it," she said. He tucked it under his arm. "We'll be in touch." He left. Wells was gone too. He'd stepped out during the 47 minutes to handle something, she didn't know what. The corridor was empty except for the security guard at the far end, who was looking at his phone with the detached patience of someone riding out the last hours of a night shift. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went back downstairs, because Hale was in post-op, and someone should check his numbers, and because being in motion was easier than being still. Hale's numbers were holding. Tran was still there. She'd apparently decided that the definition of her oversight responsibility extended to the recovery room, and she gave Emily a concise status update with the professional brevity of someone who understood that 5 words were better than 15 if the 5 words were accurate. Hale's pressure was stable. His SATs were at 96. His urine output was on the low end of acceptable, which confirmed the perfusion concern Emily had raised in the surgical suite and which the overnight team was monitoring. "He's going to have questions when he wakes up," Tran said. "About tonight?" "About all of it." Tran looked at Hale through the recovery room window. "He's been carrying a classified operational role for 18 months. That kind of sustained stress on the body. It does things. The chest injury tonight was acute, but the underlying physiological state that made it survivable or not was built over time." She paused. "He's going to need more than surgical recovery." Emily understood what she was saying. "That's above my lane." "It's above mine too," Tran said, "but someone needs to say it." They stood at the window for a moment, 2 women at 4:30 in the morning watching a man breathe. "Do you know what he was working on?" Emily asked. "Hale." Tran looked at her sideways. "You know I can't tell you that." "I know." A beat. Then Tran said with the particular careful delivery of someone choosing each word, "What I can tell you is that the task force he was supporting has been operational for 8 months, and that the assessment he was conducting in Brighton was the kind that determines whether infrastructure that a lot of people depend on gets protected." She looked back at the window. "So the 72 minutes between when that paramedic made her call and when you decompressed his chest were not a small thing." Emily didn't say anything. She was looking at Hale's face through the glass. The specific slack of sedation, the lines and the age in it, the ordinary, unremarkable face of a man who had been carrying something heavy and was now, at least temporarily, in a place where the weight had been set down for him. She was still at the window when her phone buzzed again. "Priya." A text, not a call. "Lang is out of the cath lab. They're saying he's stable. Also, admin just sent an all-staff notification. There's a mandatory meeting at 7 a.m. Board wants everyone." Emily looked at the time. It was 4:48. She had just over 2 hours. She found an empty call room on the 3rd floor and lay down on the cot in her clothes without taking her shoes off, because she'd learned the specific discipline of sleep that was a tool rather than a luxury. You closed your eyes and you told your nervous system that it was allowed to release for a defined period. And if you'd done it enough times in enough conditions, it listened. She was asleep in under 4 minutes. She woke at 6:40 without an alarm, the specific skill of an internal clock trained by years of situations where oversleeping was not an option. She had 11 minutes of disorientation that lasted approximately 3 seconds, and then the night returned to her in its full inventory and she sat up and put her feet on the floor. She washed her face in the call room sink, changed back into her own clothes that she'd left in her locker before the scrub room, and was in the main corridor at 6:55 when Priya fell into step beside her. Priya looked like someone who had also not slept, but who had used the hours differently. There was a particular focused energy to her that was not quite coffee and not quite adrenaline, more like the sustained alertness of someone who had made decisions during the night and was prepared to stand behind them in daylight. "How's Hale?" Priya asked. "Stable. Post-op numbers are holding." "And Lang?" "Out of the cath lab. Stable." Priya nodded. She was quiet for a moment as they walked. "I submitted the incident report," she said. In case nobody told you. Wells told me. Last night. Another beat. I want you to know it wasn't. Priya stopped, choosing. I didn't do it because of you, specifically. I mean, I did, but not because I thought I owed you something. I did it because I've been in that ER for 2 years, and I've watched him make calls like that, and nobody ever. She stopped again. Nobody wrote it down. Every time. We looked at each other, and we didn't write it down. She looked at Emily. You came back into that room. After he had you removed, I thought the least I could do was write it down. Emily thought about something to say and didn't say it. They walked. There are 4 other nurses who submitted statements this morning, Priya said, between about 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I don't know all of them. Some of them, I think, submitted on their own, and some of them might have talked to each other first. But there are 4. Emily stopped walking. 4. In the hours between the night's events and 7 in the morning, 4 people had sat down and put words to things they'd been not putting words to, and submitted them somewhere official where they would have to be answered. Do you know why tonight, Emily said, instead of any of the other nights? Priya thought about it. I think, she said carefully, because someone did it first, and then it was less. She searched. Less like going out on your own. They started walking again. The hospital's main conference room on the 2nd floor was a space that normally held department meetings and budget reviews and the particular bureaucratic theater of institutional life. At 7:03 in the morning, it held approximately 60 people, which was most of the night shift staff who hadn't gone home yet, plus the early morning arrivals who'd gotten the all-staff notification, plus department heads who'd come in specifically for this, plus several people in administrative dress whom Emily didn't recognize and suspected were legal. Hartwell was at the front. She was standing, not seated, which set a tone. She waited until the room reached its specific quality of full attention. Not silence exactly, but the held breath quality of people who understood that what was about to be said had weight. And then she spoke without preamble. By decision of the Board of Directors, effective as of 6:08 this morning, Dr. Victor Lang has been suspended from all clinical and administrative duties at Riverside Regional Medical Center pending a full review of his conduct. She let that sit for exactly the right length of time. Not long enough to become performance, just long enough to be received. The review encompasses events from last night as well as prior documented complaints spanning more than 2 years. The board takes clinical conduct and staff welfare with equal seriousness. The review will be thorough, and it will be public in its conclusions. The room absorbed that. Additionally, Hartwell continued, this board has been notified that a federal investigation by the Office of Inspector General into practices at this institution is currently active. We are cooperating fully. Every staff member who has information relevant to that investigation should feel both protected and encouraged to come forward. There is no retaliation tolerance at this institution. That is a statement I am making on the record, in this room, in front of 60 witnesses. Emily was near the back. She didn't raise her hand. She wasn't the kind of person who raised her hand, but she felt something shift in the room. A pressure releasing, slowly, the way pressure released when a valve was finally opened in a system that had been building for longer than was safe. She could feel it in the way people were sitting, the particular exhale that moved through a room of people who had been holding something. Hartwell looked toward the back of the room. Emily wasn't sure if it was deliberate, whether Hartwell had registered where she was standing and chose to look, or whether it was the natural direction of someone scanning a full room. But for a moment, their eyes met. Hartwell moved on. After the meeting, the corridor outside the conference room held its own smaller conversations. The informal debrief that always followed formal announcements, the recalibration of relationships and information, and what people now understood about where things stood. Emily moved through it toward the stairwell. She was on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors when Kaminsky caught up with her. He was still in the clothes he'd been in for the night shift, which meant he hadn't gone home either, and he looked wrung out in the way of someone who had run a long race and was only now feeling the distance. I heard what they said in there, he said. I was there, she said. I know. He stopped her, not grabbing, just stepped into her path on the narrow landing, which was enough. I wanted to say something to you before everything else happened. She waited. "In the bay," he said. "When I was putting in the chest tube. My hands were shaking and I missed the landmark and you said—" He paused, reconstructing it. 2 centimeters superior. You're right where you need to be. Just go up. And I went up and it was right. He looked at her. I've been turning that over because I don't know if I would have found it on my own. With Lang in the room and the monitor and everything. I don't know. You would have, she said. It might have taken longer. But he didn't have longer. No. Kaminsky was quiet for a moment. I want to be the kind of doctor who doesn't need to be talked through it, he said. That's where I want to get to. Then get there, Emily said. You know what you did wrong tonight, and you know what you did right. That's more than most people leave a shift knowing. She looked at him. The shaking is not the problem. The shaking is your body telling you the stakes are real. The problem would be if it stopped you. He nodded. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something else, and then decided not to, and stepped aside. She went down the stairs. Wells was waiting in the lobby. He had the look of a man who had slept for 2 hours in a military vehicle and considered it adequate, which was probably accurate. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the vending corridor. The machine coffee that tasted like something that had once heard about coffee, but hot, which at 7:23 in the morning was the relevant feature. He held one out. She took it. Odom left an hour ago, he said. I know, he got what he needed. The federal case moves to its next phase. Lang's suspension is issued. The military medical record on Hale is secured. He listed it the way he listed operational outcomes, factually, without editorializing. The night is accounted for. She drank the coffee. It was terrible. There's something you don't know yet, Wells said. She looked at him. The 3 prior complaints in Lang's file, the ones that didn't go anywhere. He turned his cup in his hands. The first one was from a nurse who resigned 14 months ago. She gave the OIG her initial statement 6 weeks ago. She's given 2 more since. He paused. Her name is Donna Reese. She worked in this ER for 3 years. She left because Lang made it impossible for her to stay. Emily was quiet. She never met you, Wells said. She doesn't know your name. She filed her complaint independently 7 weeks ago for her own reasons. He looked at Emily. But the case that's going to follow Victor Lang for the rest of his career started with her, not with last night, not with you. He held her gaze. You were the moment it became undeniable. She was the moment it became real. Emily thought about Donna Reese, who she would probably never meet, sitting in front of an OIG investigator 7 weeks ago and saying the things that hadn't been said in this building for years. She thought about what that cost. The specific aloneness of being first, before anyone else had moved, before there was footage or federal witnesses or a night shift full of people submitting documentation. She thought about Priya saying someone did it first and then it was less like going out on your own. Does she know what happened last night? Emily said. Odom will brief her today, Wells said. Emily nodded. The lobby was filling with the morning shift arriving, the natural influx of a hospital coming into its daytime mode. More people, more noise, the institutional engine turning over into a higher gear. Around them, life was resuming at its usual pace, which was always slightly disorienting after a night like this one, the way the ordinary world's indifference to extraordinary events could feel, at the edge of exhaustion, almost surreal. Wells set down his coffee cup on the ledge near the entrance. He turned to look at her fully. There's something else, he said. She recognized the register. It was the voice he used when the thing he was about to say had been considered and decided and was not going to be walked back. What? She said. Lang's report, he said. The one he filed last night before his cardiac event. Copies went to the state medical board and to hospital administration. He paused. It also went to a reporter. The lobby noise continued around them. Emily went very still. What reporter? She said. Freelance. Name is Tomas Varga. He covers Pacific Northwest healthcare policy. Lang apparently has a professional relationship with him, had given him access before, background material on hospital administration issues. Wells's voice was level. Varga received the report at 11:58 last night. He's been sitting on it while he makes calls. He looked at Emily. He called this hospital's communications office 40 minutes ago. He has Lang's version of events. He's going to run a story. She understood immediately what that meant. The shape of it was clear and unpleasant. Lang's version, the unauthorized nurse, the insubordination, the patient safety violation, was already written and sourced and in a reporter's hands. Everything that had happened since, the footage, the OIG investigation, Hale's status, the board's decision, all of it was on a timeline that the story might not wait for. "Does Varga know about the investigation?" she said. "Not yet. Odom's team is deciding how to handle the disclosure." Wells met her eyes. "Which leaves a window. How long?" He told the communications office he needed a response by 10 a.m. for the story to run today. She looked at the clock on the lobby wall, 2 hours and 21 minutes. "What does Hartwell know?" Emily said. "She's being briefed right now," Wells said. "Upstairs." Emily set her coffee cup down. Her name was about to be in a story she hadn't agreed to be in, attached to a narrative she hadn't written, sourced from a man who had tried to let someone die and was now, from a hospital bed with a stented artery, attempting to define the night before the night could define itself. She looked at Wells. "Take me upstairs," she said. The elevator ride to the 5th floor took 40 seconds. Emily used them. The story, as Lang had written it, was a clean and internally coherent document. She understood that without having read it, because she understood how Lang thought. He was a man who moved fast to control the record, who knew that the first version of events had gravity that later corrections struggled to overcome. He would have written it clinically, formally, with the specific vocabulary of institutional authority. Unauthorized intervention, failure to comply, patient safety concern, administrative review required. He would have positioned himself as the responsible party, attempting to maintain protocol under duress. He would not have mentioned, because he was not required to mention, and because it was not yet part of the record he controlled, that the patient had been coding when Emily returned to the bay, or that his own intervention at that point had consisted of standing still. None of that was in Lang's report, but all of it was on the footage that Odom's team had in federal custody. The question was whether Tomas Varga was a journalist who cared about that gap, or a journalist who had a source relationship with Lang that made the gap inconvenient. Hartwell was on the phone when they came in. She held up one finger and finished the call in under 90 seconds, which was the efficiency of someone who had been managing multiple simultaneous crises since before dawn and had stripped all her communication to its functional minimum. "Varga," she said when she hung up. "Yes," Wells said. Hartwell looked at Emily. "He has Lang's report, a statement from Lang's personal attorney, which was apparently drafted last night, before the cardiac event, which tells you something about how Lang was thinking, and a comment from someone identified as a senior medical staff member who characterized your return to the trauma bay as, quote, disruptive and potentially dangerous to the patient." Emily kept her face level. "Who's the senior medical staff member?" "We don't know yet." Hartwell's jaw tightened slightly. "The communications office is working on it." She looked at Wells. "The military's involvement, the surveillance, Hale's status, the JAG officer. Varga doesn't have any of that. He doesn't know Hale's identity or his role." "He's going to find the military vehicles in the parking lot," Emily said. "If he's any good." "He will," Hartwell agreed. "Which is why I've asked Odom's office to make a decision about what they're prepared to disclose and when." She turned to the window for a moment. Brighten in the early morning, gray light off the Pacific, the city not yet fully awake. Then she turned back. "What I can control is this hospital's response, and this hospital's response needs to be ready in 2 hours." "What does the response look like?" Wells said. Hartwell looked at Emily, not at Wells, at Emily. "It looks like the truth," she said. "All of it. The footage, the clinical record, the board's action this morning, the prior complaints, the OIG investigation as much as Odom authorizes us to disclose." She paused. "And it looks like who you are, what you've done, what happened in that bay last night, not Lang's version of it, the version that the monitor readings and the chart and 9 witnesses support." She held Emily's gaze. "I'm asking if you're willing to be part of this hospital's statement, named, attributed, on the record." Emily had known, somewhere in the elevator, that this was what the room upstairs was going to ask. She'd been turning it over in the 40 seconds of the ride. She'd come to Brighton to exist quietly. She'd spent 4 months constructing a version of her life that didn't require anyone to know the interior of her history, that let the work be the work and the past be the past, and the distance between them be a thing she got to decide. Last night had not respected that construction. Last night had walked through it like it wasn't there. She could still say no. She could give a limited statement through the hospital's communications office, something that satisfied the factual record without attaching her name to a media story. Wells would understand. Hartwell would manage. But Donna Reese had been first, had gone to an OIG investigator 7 weeks ago and said the things that needed saying while nobody else was saying them yet. And 4 nurses had submitted statements between 2 and 5 in the morning, and Priya had pulled the 14-gauge needle from the tray and crossed the room. Someone always had to move. "Yes," Emily said. "I'm willing." Hartwell exhaled, not loudly, just the specific breath of someone whose next move had been contingent on an answer that could have gone either way. "All right." She picked up her phone. "I'm going to get our communications director in here. We have 90 minutes to build this response, so I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning of your shift to the moment you walked out of that surgical suite." Emily sat down. She told it. It took 50 minutes with Hartwell's communications director, a man named Patrick Seo, 40-something, the particular controlled urgency bearing of someone who managed institutional crises for a living, asking questions that shaped the account into something a journalist could use. Not spin, Emily was clear on that. She wouldn't participate in spin. And Seo seemed to understand that the truth was already more compelling than anything constructed would be. He asked about the clinical sequence in the trauma bay with enough medical literacy to understand her answers. He asked about her background with the careful phrasing of someone who knew he was touching classified adjacent territory and was trying to find the edge of what could be disclosed. Wells helped navigate that part. What could be said, what the Army Medical Command would support on the record, what required Odom's sign-off. At 8:47, Seo sent a draft response to Hartwell. She read it standing at her desk, made 4 changes, and sent it to Odom's office for review of the military-relevant sections. Odom's office came back in 11 minutes. 2 sentences removed, 1 sentence modified. Everything else cleared. At 9:23, Hartwell's communications office sent a full statement to Tomas Varga. Emily's name was in it, with her permission, alongside her military background, her clinical actions of the previous night, the board's decision regarding Lang's suspension, and a reference to the active federal investigation that Odom's office had authorized them to confirm without detailing. At 9:51, Varga called the communications office back. Seo took the call and came out of the communications room 7 minutes later with an expression Emily couldn't immediately read. "He's holding the story," Seo said. Hartwell looked up. "Holding or killing?" "Holding. He says he needs 48 hours to report the full picture before he runs anything." Seo paused. "He also said, and this is a direct quote, that the statement we sent him changes the story significantly, and he's not going to run a partial version when the full version exists." The room absorbed that. "He's a real journalist," Emily said. Not a question. "Apparently," Seo said, with the mild surprise of a communications professional who had learned not to take that for granted. Wells, who had been standing near the window throughout this, unfolded his arms, the specific posture shift of a man who has been holding a position and is releasing it. "Then it's in the right hands," he said. Emily stood. Her legs had the deep ache of a night spent on hard floors and metal stair treads and OR tile, the physical bill for 12 hours of sustained attention coming due all at once. She was aware that she needed sleep in the specific way of a body that had been deferring that need for longer than was reasonable. But there was one more thing. She looked at Hartwell. "I need to see Lang." The room went quiet in a specific way. "He's in the cardiac recovery unit," Hartwell said carefully. "He's post-procedure, he's been notified of the suspension, his attorney was present, and he's been advised not to discuss the investigation." She paused. "I'm not sure seeing him serves." "It's not for the record," Emily said. "And it's not about the investigation." Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. Then, "He has the right to refuse." "I know." Hartwell picked up the phone. Lang didn't refuse. The cardiac recovery unit was on the 4th floor, quieter than the ER. The particular subdued quality of a ward where the crises had already happened, and what remained was the slow work of repair. His room was private, standard for a physician admitted to his own hospital, the particular courtesy of an institution for its staff that persisted even in suspension. His attorney was not present. His personal phone had been removed per the recovery protocol. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. He looked diminished, not devastatingly so. He was awake. He was oriented. The color had come back into his face. But the quality that had filled a room when he entered it, the gravitational authority that had made Roy the security guard apologetic and Kaminsky hesitant and Priya look away, was gone. Or not gone. Deflated. The room didn't rearrange itself around him anymore. He was just a man in a hospital bed with leads on his chest and an IV in his arm, which was the same condition as every other patient in this wing. She came in and sat in the chair beside the bed without asking, because she was done asking permission for chairs. He looked at her. His expression was complicated in the specific way of a man who had done something and knew it and was currently in the position of not being able to frame it the way he'd intended. She didn't speak first. She'd sat down to say something, but she wasn't going to fight him for the space to say it. Lang looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "You came back," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. The aftermath of intubation in the cath lab, or simply exhaustion, or both. "To the bay, after Roy walked you out." "Yes." "Why?" It was a genuine question. She could hear that in it. Not rhetorical, not adversarial. A man trying to understand something he hadn't understood when it mattered. "Because he was dying," she said, "and I knew what to do." "You were off the case. I'd removed you." "Yes." "So why—" He stopped. He seemed to be encountering something in the question that complicated the ending. "Because I wasn't there for you," Emily said. Not harshly, just as a fact. "I was there for him. Your opinion of me wasn't relevant to what was happening in his chest." Lang was quiet. He looked at his own hands, the specific inspection of a surgeon looking at the tools of his work, which she recognized because she'd done it too. "What you did," he said slowly, "in the bay, the procedure sequence. A pause that had something reluctant in it. It was correct. I know. I was going to intubate first. I know that too." He didn't apologize. She hadn't come for an apology. Apologies from people like Victor Lang were performances with audiences, and there was no audience here, and she didn't want the performance. What she was witnessing instead was something smaller and harder and probably more genuine. A man beginning the slow, unpleasant work of reckoning with a gap between who he believed himself to be and what the record actually showed. That was its own kind of consequence, possibly the one that would last longest. "Your background," he said. "I didn't know. It wouldn't have changed the procedure sequencing." He looked at her directly. "No, I mean—" He stopped again. "I dismissed you because you were a nurse, not because of anything you did or said." He said it flatly, without ornament, the confession of someone removing a layer of the comfortable narrative. "The moment you questioned me, I'd already decided who you were." Emily didn't say anything. "That's what the report is going to show," he said, "that I'd already decided, before I saw the patient, before you said anything." He looked at the ceiling again. 9 people in that room watched me decide before I looked at the man. The monitor beside his bed registered his heartbeat in steady green peaks, the reassuring rhythm of a muscle that had been saved by exactly the kind of intervention he'd been about to deny someone else. The irony of that was not something she needed to name. It was present in the room without being named, the way certain truths were. "There are 4 nurses who submitted statements this morning," Emily said, "about things that happened before last night." His jaw moved. "I heard. There are more who might." She looked at him. "The investigation is going to go where it goes. I didn't come here to tell you what to expect from it. I came here because—" She paused, finding the actual reason. Because I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not from a report, not from an attorney's summary. From me. Hear what? That I would have come back to that bay regardless of who was dying in it, she said. It didn't matter that it was your patient. It didn't matter what you'd said to me in the hallway or how many times you'd made it clear that you considered me furniture. She held his gaze steadily. The work doesn't care about any of that, and I've been doing the work long enough that I don't either. Lang looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not gratitude exactly, not remorse exactly, but something in the territory between them that didn't have a clean name. You'll be recognized for this, he said. What you did? Probably. That's not why you did it. No, she said. It's not. She stood. She wasn't going to stay longer. She'd said what she'd come to say and the rest of it. The investigation, the suspension, the professional consequences that were going to unfold over the coming months and reshape whatever remained of his career was not her work. Her work had been in the trauma bay at 11:47 and in the administration corridor floor at 3 a.m. when she'd pressed her fingers to the wrist of a man she had reason to walk past. She was at the door when he said, "Carter." She turned. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out rough and without the cadence of a prepared statement, which made it the most credible thing she'd heard him say. "For what I said, and for what I didn't see." She looked at him for a moment. A man in a hospital bed, diminished, at the beginning of something he hadn't chosen and couldn't avoid. "Get better," she said, "and then do it differently." She left. The hallway outside Lang's room was ordinary and quiet. She stood in it for a moment with her hand against the wall, not for support, just contact, the specific grounding of a surface under your palm when you've been in motion for too long. She thought about what he'd said. You'll be recognized for this. She'd done the work for 31 months in conditions where recognition was classified and the people who knew what you'd done couldn't say so in public, and the people who could see the outcomes never saw the process. She'd learned in that time that recognition was not the engine of the work. The engine was something smaller and more personal. The specific moment when you knew you'd done the right thing correctly, and that knowledge settled in you like ballast, and you carried it forward into the next time you needed it. Last night had been that, several times over. She pushed off the wall and went to find Wells. He was in the lobby again. She was beginning to understand that Wells stationed himself in lobbies the way other people staked out command posts. The lobby was the intelligence position, the place where you could see what was moving in and out of an environment and make assessments accordingly. He was drinking more of the terrible vending machine coffee and looking at his phone, and he looked up when she came off the elevator with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been waiting without performing waiting. "How was that?" he said. "Necessary," she said. He handed her the second cup of coffee he'd apparently gotten in anticipation of her return. She took it. It was still hot, which meant he'd timed it correctly, which was so precisely a Wells thing to do that she found it briefly and unexpectedly funny. "The story," she said. "Varga filed his preliminary piece an hour ago," Wells said. "It's online. He included a note that it's the first of a two-part account, and the full reporting will run in 48 hours. He tilted his phone toward her. He used the statement. She read the first 3 paragraphs. Varga wrote clean, tight sentences, the kind of journalist who had been doing it long enough to trust the facts to carry the weight without help. The statement was quoted accurately and in full. Lang's report was referenced as a document that, quote, presents a different account of the night's events from what hospital security footage and multiple witnesses describe. Careful, specific, legally protected, and devastating in the gap it implied without asserting. She handed the phone back. "And Lang?" she said. "His attorney issued a statement through the state medical board contact this morning. It's—" Wells paused, the search for the right word visible. "Careful. It acknowledges the investigation without conceding specific conduct. It's what attorneys write when the documentary evidence is substantial and they're managing exposure. Which means they've seen the footage." "Which means they've seen the footage," Wells confirmed. She thought about the 31 months of documentation in Odom's files. The residents who'd left, the nurses who'd stayed and hadn't written it down until now, the prior complaints that had gone nowhere until there was footage and a federal case number and a military officer in the administrator's office explaining jurisdiction. Systems moved slowly, They required accumulation of evidence, of courage, of witnesses who were willing to be first. Last night had not been a single moment of justice arriving like weather. It had been the point at which enough accumulated mass reached the threshold that made movement inevitable. She'd been the trigger. Donna Reese had been the foundation, and everything in between had been built by people who did the work quietly and stayed in the building and wrote it down when it finally became possible to write it down. At 11 in the morning, Wells found her in the break room near the ER. The one with the dented microwave and the whiteboard that still had a joke on it from a week ago that nobody had erased. The particular lived-in shabbiness of a room where people retreated to be briefly human in the middle of very long days. He sat across from her at the small table. "There's something I need to do today," he said, "and I'd like you to be there." She waited. "The Army Medical Command authorized a formal commendation for your actions last night," he said. "Not for the military record. That's separate, and it's already being processed. This is a public commendation issued in acknowledgement of service performed in a civilian context." He held her gaze. "They want to present it here, in this building, today." She opened her mouth. "I know," he said. "You didn't do it for the commendation." "Wells, I know that, and the people in this hospital know that too." He leaned forward slightly. "But there are 4 nurses who submitted statements this morning at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning. There are 9 people in that trauma bay who watched something happen that they're going to be thinking about for the rest of their careers." He paused. "And there is a woman named Donna Reese who went to a federal investigator 7 weeks ago and said things that nobody wanted to say. And she's going to read about last night, and she is going to need to know that it mattered." Emily was quiet. "It's not for you," he said. "Or, it is for you, but it's not only for you. It's for what it means when something like this gets seen." He held her gaze. "Let it be seen." She looked at the dented microwave, at the whiteboard joke, at the institutional shabbiness of a room where real people spent the ordinary minutes of days that occasionally contained extraordinary things. "All right," she said. "They did it at 2 in the afternoon, in the main corridor outside the emergency department, which was Hartwell's choice, and a good one. Not the conference room, not the lobby, not a space associated with administration. The place where the work happened. Approximately 45 people gathered. Not everyone. The ER ran continuously and patients didn't pause for ceremonies. But the staff who could be spared, the department heads, Kaminsky, who looked like he'd finally gone home and changed and come back, and Priya, who stood near the front with the composed expression of someone who had already processed the night and arrived at something on the other side of it. Reyes was there. She stood to one side with her arms folded and her surgeon's posture, watching with the specific evaluative attention she gave to everything, which was somehow the most respectful thing about her presence. Wells stood in the corridor in full service dress and said simply what Emily Carter had done. Not everything. The classified elements remained classified, and that would never change, but the shape of it. 9 years of service, 3 operational deployments, the 72 hours. The protocols that existed in Army field surgical teams because of documentation generated from cases she'd managed. The 4 months in Brighton working night shifts as an ER nurse because she'd wanted to do the work without the weight. And then last night. He didn't dramatize it. He described it, which was more effective. The patient in cardiac arrest, the intervention that the footage documented, the 2 hours in the OR, the man in cardiac recovery on the 4th floor who had been served his suspension notice that morning. The corridor was very quiet. When Wells finished, he produced the commendation, a formal document in a presentation folder, the Army Medical Command seal on the cover, and held it out to Emily. She took it. The corridor applauded. Not the performed applause of a mandatory institutional event, the real kind. Uneven, a little ragged, some people more than others, the sound of people who were doing it because they meant it and not because they'd been told to. Emily stood in the middle of it and felt, strangely, that the most honest thing about the moment was how imperfect it was. The corridor lighting was still slightly too harsh. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, more or less. The commendation folder had a small dent in one corner where it had presumably been carried in Wells's vehicle. Someone's pager went off, and they had to leave. The moment didn't resolve into something cinematic and clean because moments almost never did. But Priya was in front of her, and her eyes were doing the thing they'd been doing since 2 a.m. That specific controlled brightness of someone who had decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to cry at work and was therefore not going to cry at work. And Kaminsky was nodding at her with the expression of a man filing something away very permanently, and Reyes met her eyes from across the corridor and did the thing that Reyes did, which was to simply hold eye contact for long enough to convey something that she clearly considered didn't require words. That was enough. It was more than enough. She thought briefly about Donna Reese, about what she would read in 48 hours when Varga's full story ran, and what it would mean to know that the 7 weeks she'd spent talking to investigators in the careful, deliberate work of being first had arrived somewhere. She made a note to ask Wells whether there was a protocol for reaching out. There probably wasn't. She'd find a way anyway. After, when the corridor had dispersed back into its ordinary business and the ER was running again and the building had resumed its function, Wells found her near the entrance to the trauma wing. "The position," she said. He waited. "I want to know the full scope," she said, "before I decide. What it would actually require. What the work looks like day to day." She looked at him. "Not the version you pitch to someone you're recruiting. The version you'd give someone who's going to do it." Wells almost smiled. It was the closest he usually got. "I'll set up a briefing, and I want it to be here," she said. Brighton. "I'm not going back to a base." He considered that for a moment. "The program isn't location dependent. It's designed to operate across civilian and military institutions. The hub can be wherever the director makes it." "Then I want it here." She looked at him steadily. "There's work to do in this building. The training protocols, the staff development. What I saw last night in that trauma bay with Kaminsky. What I saw with the response time on the floor assessment, there are gaps that are not about individual competence. They're about systemic preparation." She paused. "I can work on that from inside." "Yes," Wells said. "You can." The late afternoon light was coming through the east corridor windows now. The thin, watery light of November in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of light that didn't promise warmth but was honest about its quality. The parking lot outside was ordinary. No convoy. Just the regular configuration of a hospital parking lot at shift change. People arriving, people leaving, the constant, unglamorous circulation of a building that never stopped. Emily stood in the light and thought about what the next thing looked like. She'd come to Brighton 4 months ago with the intention of being small, of fitting into a role that didn't demand the parts of her that had been most used and most costly. She'd wanted rest in the form of obscurity, and for a while she'd had it. And then a man she didn't know had been hit by a vehicle on a street she'd never walked, and a paramedic she would never meet had made a judgment call about transport distance, and the night had taken the shape that night sometimes took, the shape that found you rather than the one you planned. She understood now that she'd never actually been at rest. She'd been accumulating. The 4 months of quiet shifts and observed patterns and noted gaps had been, without her conscious intention, preparation for exactly what last night had required. You didn't stop being what you were just because you stopped announcing it. You carried it forward, and sometimes it sat still for months, and then something needed it, and it was there. That was the thing about the work. It didn't negotiate with your preferences about when to be used. 3 days later, Marcus Hale was moved from post-op to a standard recovery room, which was the specific medical progress of a man who was going to survive. He was awake, oriented, and according to Tran's brief message to Emily, asking questions about his case, about the night, about the nurse he'd been told had stabilized him in the trauma bay before he'd lost consciousness. Tran said he wanted to speak with her when he was stronger. Emily sent back, "Tell him there's no rush." 5 days after that, the Oregon State Medical Board opened a formal disciplinary review of Dr. Victor Lang, citing the events of the night in question alongside the 3 prior complaints now incorporated into the active record. The review was a matter of public record, announced on the board's website in the understated institutional language of regulatory bodies that had learned to say significant things without performing them. Lang's attorney issued no new statement. 2 weeks later, Tomas Varga's full story ran. It was long. 6,000 words, which for a healthcare policy piece was the length of something written by someone who had spent the reporting time it deserved. Emily read it in the break room with the dented microwave early in the morning before her shift. Varga had found Donna Reese. He'd interviewed her. She wasn't named. She'd asked for anonymity, which Varga honored. But the account of what she'd experienced and what she'd done about it ran as a substantial section of the piece, and it was written with the specific care of a journalist who understood that her decision to be first was the load-bearing element of everything that followed. Emily sat with that for a moment. She didn't know Donna Reese's face or her voice or the particular accumulation of experiences that had taken her to an OIG investigator's office 7 weeks before a night that would eventually be the subject of a 6,000-word article. She only knew the shape of the decision, the one made alone, without witnesses, without knowing whether it would go anywhere or simply dissipate into the institutional silence that had absorbed so many similar things before. She put her phone down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Some people went to investigators at 3 in the afternoon on a quiet Tuesday because they had finally reached the end of what they could absorb without doing something about it. And it didn't feel heroic when they did it. It felt like the only remaining option. It felt terrifying and necessary, and very much like going out on your own. Until someone else moved. Until something else was written down. Until the footage existed and the federal case number was attached, and a night shift full of people submitted documentation between 2 and 5 in the morning because someone had been first, and now it was less like going out alone. That was how it worked. Not dramatically, not all at once. In accumulation, and in the specific courage of whoever agreed to go first without knowing whether anyone would follow. 6 weeks after the night, Riverside Regional Medical Center adopted 5 new emergency trauma protocols, procedures developed by the Army Medical Command's Forward Surgical Program from documentation that included Emily's operational cases as official training standards for all ER staff. The hospital's director of nursing training, who was newly titled and newly appointed, was listed in the implementation memo as the lead on the curriculum development. The title on the memo read, E. Carter, Director, Emergency Trauma Training and Integration. Kaminsky found her in the simulation lab the first week she was using it, a converted storage room that had been partly retrofitted with used mannequins and portable monitoring equipment, and a whiteboard that was rapidly becoming covered in the kind of clinical shorthand that meant the room was being used seriously. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a resident who was deciding whether to interrupt. She waved him in. "I heard you're doing a session on tension pneumo assessment Friday," he said. 6 a.m., she confirmed, before the day shift. "Can I come?" She looked at him. He was holding a coffee and wearing the expression of someone who was asking for something they'd half decided they weren't going to ask for and had asked for anyway, the vulnerability of that visible in the slight forward tilt of his posture. "It's mandatory for ER residents," she said. "So yes, you can come." She paused. "Bring your hands. We're using the simulation kit." He nodded, visibly relieved. "Kaminsky," she said before he left. He turned. "The shaking," she said. "It's been stopping, hasn't it?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Now bring someone else with you Friday. Someone who shakes." He left. She went back to the whiteboard. The work looked like this. It looked like 6 a.m. sessions and borrowed simulation equipment and protocols built from documentation that traced back to cases in places that couldn't be named, translated into language that an ER resident in Brighton, Oregon could use on a Tuesday night when the bay was full and the monitor was changing pitch, and the decision had to be made before there was time to think it through. It looked like preparation, which was what she'd always been doing, in every environment, under every condition, whether she was doing it with a rank and a title or with a nurse's badge and a night shift schedule. She was still doing it, differently now, in a building she was beginning to know in the specific way of someone who was going to stay. Outside the simulation lab's one small window, Brighton moved through its late autumn morning. The ordinary circulation of a mid-sized Pacific Northwest city going about its business, not knowing and not needing to know what had happened in the building on Hargrove Avenue 5 weeks ago, or who worked in the converted storage room on the second floor, or what she was building in there. That was all right. The work didn't need an audience. It needed the people in the room on Friday morning, willing to be bad at something first so they could be better at it when it mattered. Emily turned back to the whiteboard. She had a session to build. There's something that doesn't get said enough about the people who know what they're doing and say nothing about it until the moment arrives when saying nothing costs someone their life. They aren't being modest. They aren't waiting for permission. They're carrying the weight of what they know without requiring anyone to acknowledge it, because they learned somewhere along the way that the work is not about being seen. The work is about being ready. The hardest part is never the crisis itself. It's the years of preparation that nobody witnesses. The early shifts and the studied silences and the decision to stay in a room where you're being told you don't belong because you know something the room doesn't yet know it needs. What happened in one emergency bay on one November night in one Oregon hospital is not a story about justice arriving, though it did. It's not a story about a single exceptional person, though she was. It's a story about what happens when the right preparation meets the right moment and someone decides not to look away. The patient recovered. The physician faced the consequences his record had been building toward for 31 months. The nurse became the director. The resident stopped shaking. The woman who went to the investigator first read a 6,000-word article and understood that what she'd done had landed. None of it was clean. Very little of it was easy. Most of it happened in corridors and recovery rooms and converted storage spaces at hours when no one was watching. That's what it looks like when it's real.